Carolina bays at our latitude in South Carolina are elliptical depressions which are bilaterally symmetrical with an axis pointed toward the northwest Great Lakes area. They range in size from 50 yards to perhaps 8 miles across, and the depressions all tend to hold water. Many are surrounded by rings of sand, often white, sometimes brown, red, or gray. The only explanation that makes any sense is that the bays are secondary ejecta from primary impacts that occurred across the Great Lakes area. The ejecta patterns form curtains downrange from the primary impacts that spread out into 3 arcs downrange across the United States. Each regular-sized bay required a force the size of a Hiroshima bomb to form it, and there are still 500,000 bays visible on the North American continent. The fact that there are still bays visible on the surface means that everywhere there is a bay visible, that surface impact in shallow raised rim has survived wind, rain, flood, storm, surge, and erosion since the event that formed the bays. Logically, there were also bays in between the bay-rich areas which no longer exist due to erosion, and secondary impacts which landed in the oceans and rivers. Odds are, with the bays remaining in Nebraska, Kansas, and the Delmarva Basin, and all across the eastern seaboard, some within 100 yards of the Atlantic Ocean, that the event which created the bays is relatively recent geologically speaking, likely within the last 15,000 years. By extending the axis of the bay rims, you can quickly identify that there were at least 3 primary impacts. Because there are 3 areas downrange where the bay angles point directly north, by extending the bay axis, trajectories suggest themselves on a stationary map to lead back to origins to the west of the primary impact points. These lines reveal that the different globs of ejecta that form the bays had different flight times and differing offsets because of sidereal speed differential at latitude. Sidereal speed at latitude can be easily computed at online websites. It is the differential between the origin and destination which is of critical interest in adjusting the flight bearings. As the ejecta was flying, the Earth was turning to the east underneath the trajectories, and this is one indelible feature of verifying the ejecta duration hypothesis. These are mathematical formulas which are verified by naval ballistics and artillery science, and not conjecture. Each bay is surrounded also by pulverized quartz crystals, which is the same as glacier flour, which comes out from underneath glaciers in Canada and Alaska. The glacier flour dissolves in fresh water, and this creates a bathtub ring around each bay in a farmer's field, because under each bay is a bowl that was formed by dehydrated sands heating up like the space shuttle on re-entry. The rising water around and in the bathtub ring will float the white powder, reforming the ring no matter how often the farmer plows down the field. This white powder dries out of solution around the rim, but when the bay is trenched, white sand and glacier flour flows out of the bay, downriver to eventually precipitate out into bluff mud when it concentrates in a saltwater estuary. The glacier flour makes the white water acidic and dissolves tannins in the vegetation. Glacier flour that has not encountered vegetation makes the water white, stunts fish growth because the fish gills can't operate with sandpaper-like particles in the water, and the little fish in Lake Louise and Lake Waccamaw, North Carolina are the result. Mathematically, the speed of the ejecta is predictably lower than orbital and escape velocity, so the ejecta curtain will have a known limit as to its distance from its launch point, and importantly cover even the areas downrange where there is now erosion, surface rivers, and swamps. When all the primary launch points are considered, the primary impacts which produce the main ejecta curtains in the eastern United States are Wisconsin, Saginaw Bay, Michigan, and Ohio, West Virginia. However, there are other impacts further north which share the same characteristic penetration funnels, which were under the ice sheets, geological footprints, and directional imperatives, such as the Slave Geological Province, the Anastapoka Arc, Hudson Bay, Prince Edward Sound, and these impacts would have provided enough energy to cause a continental tectonic plate separation and movement of the tectonic layer of the North American continent to the southwest, totaling about 1,000 miles. This plate shift gives rise to a change in the directional sidereal east, which reveals itself in the directional changes in splash chevrons surrounding the initial secondary impacts, and the changes of direction of true north of foundations of constructions of previous civilizations that predated the collision, such as Teotihuacan Pyramid and the pyramids which predated the upper levels of Chichen Itza. The constellations represented by the pyramid complexes were likely the Serpens constellation, which according to Stellarium would have had to have been constructed when the pyramid was located at a latitude where Arkansas is located now. The Earth's crust was separated at Baffin Bay in the Labrador Sea, and the folds in the Earth's crust at Monterey and the movement of the Yellowstone hot spot under the tectonic plate shift reveal the extent and the direction of the plate shift. The counterintuitive precession in the Earth's orbital wobble is also explainable by the size of the Carolina Bay String of Pearls overall impacts. All of the civilization in North America was wiped out by this event. The continent had to be repopulated by people from Asia. The material which formed the bays was not solid anything, but was composed of sand and sublimated water vapor, nor the consistency of a slushy which dehydrates on its forward periphery on re-entry and then splats out onto the ground, compressing and tattooing itself into the surface. It produces a bow wave characteristic of a boat moving through water and throws out clumps of ice into its downrange direction and outward onto its rims, which ice melts and leaves rims of whatever sand was blasted out of the top several geological layers of the state of Ohio, West Virginia, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The compression of the soil beneath the impacts creates columns of compressed earth beneath and fired bowls of impermeable soil that comprise the mesas out west and result in there being long-lived depressions even in swamps. The tectonic plate shift explains why the splash chevrons no longer seem to point to sidereal east, although I am convinced that sidereal speed and pre-existing lakes, rivers, and bodies of water are responsible in part for the directional component of the splash chevrons. I have tested the sand in and around hundreds of Carolina bays. The sand has never been in an ocean. Muriatic acid test, even at Lewis Ocean Bay Heritage Preserve, just a mile away from Myrtle Beach, reveal no calcium or seashell deposits, and the grains are large, irregular, not polished, and unstained with tannins. Beach sand has been rolled in the surf, blown by the wind, polished smaller grains, and causes muriatic acid to foam because of seashells and calcium. Carolina Bay sand is not river sand and it is not ocean sand, but rather the ocean sand and the White River sand was brought to the Carolina Bay ejecta curtain areas by the primary ejections. Overlaying the Shoemaker-Levy patterns on the primary impacts reveals the origin of the white rivers of sand everywhere. The width of the floodplains also give rise to conclusions about how much water was contained in the ejecta. The inland floodplains reveal that there was no water available to create the wider floodplains below the so-called fall line, and the width of the floodplains also give rise to conclusions about how much water was contained in the ejecta, consistently creating new rivers of sand in between the ancient 4-mile river basins to the sea from the mountains. The partially eroded Carolina bays on either side of the river basins give rise to river basins of predictable width due to the hydration contained in the ejecta. These river basins were created as part of one event. In general, Carolina bays were created within 10 minutes downrange by ejecta moving at 100 miles per minute. Ejecta with higher launch angles just took longer to come back down. But this produces two characteristic patterns. The ejecta moving the same direction as the Earth is turning have overlapping impacts, which daisy chain into new river systems and surface drainage, but the ejecta heading west separates out into impacts which are separated from one another. Two separate globs which are launched at different angles would have differing flank times, which would alter their impact angles due to sidereal speed and the Coriolis effect, and then the whole surface would be rotated by the tectonic plate shift. According to how close the edges of the continental plate the bays were located. The eastern edge of the continent was pushed northeast, the interior to the southwest, and opposite along the San Andreas Fault out west. The Pacific Basin to the north, interior of the continent to the southwest, rotating those surface locations to the interior edge of the plate shift. This phenomena can be quantified by the floodplain shifts seen in the Santee River Basin and the channel terraces of Aynor, South Carolina, which are areas morphed and lifted up by isostatic tension resulting from rising water levels as the Carolina Bay impacts and tectonic plate shifts melted the Laurentide ice sheet. We are looking at the explanation for the Baffin Bay separation of the North American continent, the shift in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, precession, the explanation for the Grand Canyon, the migration of the Yellowstone hotspot, the formation of the mesas out west, the extinction of the woolly mammoths, North American horse, dog-faced bears, and three-toed sloths, the shift in the orientation of Teotihuacan Pyramid and why it's based on the constellation of Ophiuchus and Serpens, the flying feathered serpent, and not Orion, the rivers of sand all across the American continent, and the patterns of the Shoemaker-Levy comet. The reason there remain meteor showers in the ecliptic plane of the Earth's orbit every year as the Earth passes through slightly different locations and our orbit around the sun littered with debris from the Carolina Bay impacts which exceeded orbital velocity. This is why underground cities existed in Earth's history as people escaped random re-entry of superheated debris returning to the planet, destroyed cities like Tanis, Sodom, and Gomorrah. There is a direct feature of a directional imperative in each of these superheated catastrophes related to sidereal east. Carolina bays across several states in disparate locations show the same type of plants growing in the sand rims, right down to reindeer lichen, which only grows in Canada, pear cactus, and pincushion moss. And these plants are growing incredibly in the sand rims of bays in South Carolina, North and South Carolina, a distance of several hundred miles between them, and each place I've gone to I've been able to see the same type of plants growing in the sand rims. Okay, we got pear cactus right here. Harrison spotted it, and there's more of it in the brush along here. It's Lake Singletary along the path out to the sand rim. We already got pear cactus. Look at that, pincushion moss and cladonia all right here in this little batch. So we've successfully established that part of our thesis, and we can give it a rest anytime we want to, but I want to get out here and see the white sand.